and what is philosophy? Deleuze kind of teases out some differences there, talking about concepts, philosophical concepts having consistency, or being on a plane of consistency that kind of cuts through the infinite. And it can only do that because it doesn't have any fixed reference. Whereas he calls scientific functions, they function on a plane of reference. And so a lot of like the concerns of analytic philosophy to make language precise, it's all about reference, right? And so a lot of the paradoxes that come about from having fixed references come about at the limit of reference, whereas Deleuze kind of is able to create a plane of consistency with concepts through distinguishing concepts with reference, which would be a kind of scientific function, and ones that have consistency, which would be properly philosophical in the sense that they're creative and open systems.
Okay, so there's the key there then is a distinction between concepts and reference. Concepts, it being possible to look at concepts apart from reference. Is that what you're getting at?
Right. They have connections to, they're not, I mean, the whole point I think for Deleuze is coming out of Bergson is there's a distinction between like a realm of continuity, which he calls the virtual, coming out of Bergson, and then like having this discrete realm of things that can be divided. And so there's different kinds of multiplicities in Bergson's terminology. And so yeah, the realm of continuity, or the virtual, is where philosophy is at home, according to him. And so it has connections, and so it's not like concepts are these discrete things that have no connections or references to anything else, but they're references to other concepts and ideas, and then they become determined through actualization. And so they become discrete and then become determined through their use. But then, that does set up boundaries, and then there's paradoxes at the high and low points of the kind of hierarchies that are created in logic when you have like references. But then those are all kind of just a kind of like a conditioning of what is for him this transcendental plane, which is not this transcendental condition, but is actually the unconditioned, which becomes conditioned through actualization and through its use.
So that kind of seems like that touches on his approach to, or his description of his philosophy as one of immanence.
Right.
So he's kind of going in the direction of the transcendental through immanent. The description of immanence, and that's similar to what I see Derrida doing as well, with any sort of notion of transcendence. It's how was it put? It at some point the notion of universals is retained, but you arrive at a universal through, in essence, what is an approach to the immanent or the present, and that then makes it possible for there to be a notion of the transcendent, but it's what's the word? Contingent. It's temporary. It's something that is functioning as universal in at this given point in time, but which remains open rather than closed, so that it doesn't, in that sense, have a limit. Is that meshing with what your understanding of getting away from a strict notion of limit? Working
more or less, but I think there's some big differences with the way Derrida and Deleuze kind of come at these concepts, and I think at the limits of their own ideas, then there are some definite differences and distinctions. But I think they're kind of coming at things in a similar way. I do tend to see Derrida as kind of coming at things from within, and so there's, especially in his later work, kind of when he's reading Levinas, and he's kind of has this fascination with the quasi transcendence of the other, and so there is this kind of almost religious awe, or like, or at least just this conceptual orientation towards transcendence. Whereas I think, Deleuze is always just like in the middle of things and always just looking at the connections between things. And I think, and for instance, in his early work on logic of sense, I mean, he does talk about, he was always adamant, like, I am a metaphysician. And in the logic of sense, he talks about the eternity of sense. And so it's not that it's just this, transcendental illusion that things are kind of stable only for us to use in specific situations. It's not just, yes, it's always contingent, but there is something that is eternal about sense. And rather than it being some kind of like eternal core of truth that then just gets kind of like applied or actualized in different ways, that would be kind of more of like a Neoplatonic emanationist perspective, or even some versions of some readings of Spinoza, where substance is like expressed in its modes. But Deleuze kind of takes Spinoza, and he's like, he kind of just gets rid of substance, or he makes substance itself, even though it has this metaphysical and the sense of being that, the transcendent or eternal, it's immanent in the sense that it's thoroughly dependent on the relations. So, and I actually, when I was reading that, it made me think a lot of a book that I like a lot, a more popular book called Seth Speaks, where the author Jane Roberts, the way she kind of talks about the history of consciousness. There's this concept in esoteric thinking, even though she didn't really read esoteric stuff, but obviously it's very esoteric, a lot of similar concepts. But there's this concept of like the akashic record, where like everything is kind of that's ever happened is there in some field or whatnot. Yeah, and at one point she like she asked her husband, what do you want for Christmas? He is a painter, and he's like, I want a book on Cezanne. So rather than buying a book on Cezanne, she was, such a gifted channel, whatever. She didn't know much about painting at all, but she went in to like this library of hers in her head, and she was able to she channeled this whole book, and I read it. It's great from the point of view of Paul Cezanne right after he died. And her husband was a painter, loved it, and thought there's all kinds of commentary on painting and what it's like, and Seth in the intro of the book. So I was like, hey, it's not that like this is just him, and this is filtered through her, and it's filtered through a point of view that he had roughly after he died. But it's simultaneous, but it's like it has a position kind of so it's kind of heavily conditioned description, and I think it's very postmodern in a lot of ways, of a description of what a lot of mystics have talked about for a long time. And the reason Deleuze's sense made me think of that, because it is in a way like the sense of something, every time it's used or applied, it has a different context. It's adding context to it. But in a way, everything that ever happens, anything that's ever made some sense in any time in the universe, it's eternal in a way. Like everything is eternal, but it's eternal because in every instance that it's applied, every context, it adds new meaning. And you can only approach it within a context. It doesn't mean that there's some eternal core identity that then context or relations are added to it. Everything's thoroughly relational, but it's still, every relation is eternal. Not that it's never changing, but then it can always be returned. And this is, I think, Deleuze's embrace of, or his kind of real transformation, I think, of Nietzsche's concept of the eternal return, that nothing is anything essentially, yet it is like always returning eternally. So eternal is important in his metaphysics.
So just a quick question on that part. So when you're returning to that, are you returning to a relation at kind of like as it once was, or are you returning to it in just another context?
Right. So yeah, the relations are eternal, but they're only always being repeated within another context of relations, right? And so it's not, I'm just trying to make a distinction that like It's not that there's a core or essence and then relations,
Right.
and then relations are always changing and ephemeral. It's not like there's, this is similar to what I talk about in my physics essay that you read with space and time. There's always some kind of thing that gets frozen and thing that's changing, but really both change and stasis are abstractions. Space and time are both abstractions, because everything is always kind of abstract, using an abstraction to kind of create a static kind of ground, and then things are changing in relation to that. But really, it's just an infinitely relational field.
So, I actually read Seth Speaks years ago, and I'm having difficulty now remembering, the essence of it. I can remember bits and pieces, but can you draw just maybe an expansive connection between what you're saying right now and Seth Speaks, and how that kind of fits?
Sure, yeah, that's Jane Roberts, the author, she was just like one of the most prolific and brilliant metaphysical writers, I think, in recent times. She wasn't like a great mystic or anything like Rudolf Steiner or Sri Aurobindo in the early 20th century. I kind of think of the early 20th century in esotericism as having these, not only in esotericism, but in metaphysics in general. And philosophy had its greats with Bergson and Heidegger and Whitehead and others. But they set up these kind of modernist, like behemoths. They're just like these huge systems. Steiner just created this vast cosmology. Aurobindo created this book that I read to my girlfriend every night, Savitri. It's this 900-page poem that's just like poetically describing the universe, but it's all within a kind of consistent mythology. Seth Speaks and all the Seth books that Jane Roberts channeled in the 70s and early 80s, yeah, they have a very postmodern flavor. And so I don't think she was some kind of great mystic, but she was just really like, because she was just tapping into it and it was all coming through her kind of half consciously. I mean, really, she's, if you see any videos of her like channeling, she was just very kind of like chain smoking, and like she just had to drink some wine to get things going. She was just very kind of like not some enlightened mystic at all, but she was just very creative. Wrote tons of her own books, poetry, and then these Seth books where she was just, she wasn't into mysticism at all. She just kind of went into a trance one day and like wrote something without knowing it, and then she went and got a Ouija board with her husband, and then realized she didn't need the Ouija board, and then boom, here she's writing these great books. No editing, no, like just like dictating book after book with no need to like edit herself or slow down, just like all this stuff.
It's amazing.
Amazing. Yeah. And a lot of the ideas that are in there like have become somewhat cliches in the New Age, because I think it really went on to influence a lot of the New Age. But if you actually read the books, they're quite sophisticated, even though they are written from a popular in a popular language. And so one of the main ideas, is kind of, at least in Seth Speaks, which is the kind of the beginning book. There's some other ones that get a little more complex, but in Seth Speaks, they kind of talk about reincarnation, and the subtitle is The Eternal Validity of the Soul. And so it sounds very woo-woo like New Age, but when you get in there, especially in the later books, it's the sense of identity is thoroughly relational, right? And so you have, I think, something you didn't really get as much in the modernists, and I think that was part of the problem with a lot of the metaphysical projects of kind of that swan song of metaphysics in the early 20th century, is that once Heidegger and especially since postmodernism came along, a lot of those things weren't able to translate very well into this kind of post-structural, or I would just say relational thinking. Thinking of it, it's post-essentialist. Whereas so much metaphysics for most of history has been very very essentialist. But really, I think it doesn't take much to kind of like turn it around a bit. And Deleuze, I think, definitely does that. He was very influenced by esoteric stuff in his early days, wrote explicitly about it. Even in his later works, he there's many references to like Carlos Castaneda and like 1,000 Plateaus and stuff. So he was, I think, trying to kind of, he had something against overarching metaphysical systems, but he was definitely trying to do metaphysics, and he was definitely in touch with a lot of like esoteric thought. And as postmodern or post-structuralist as he is, yeah, there's a concept of the eternal. There's a concept of I think continuity, which I think is an important kind of structural consideration when you're talking about metaphysics. And I think that's what interests me the most, is this kind of this this agon between advocates of continuity, and which I think goes along with relational thinking, and then this kind of advocacy of discrete thinking. And I think even postmodernists that kind of emphasize the discrete, they end up like talking about like the openness of systems and then going to the limits. They emphasize limits and the kind of like, and so this notion of the transcendent, of being beyond the limit, ends up being the kind of haunting figure of their thought. Whereas I think Deleuze just operates, what I think is at the transcendent level, which is this, within things, always creating and connecting, and not really worried about limits. Because if you're actually thinking relationally, every limit, every condition or determination is, I think he says this in What is Philosophy, it's only a negation if it's just relating things to other definite things. If you're relating it to some open, undetermined field, then determination isn't negation. You're adding context to things every time. Even if you critically determine something, you're adding context. You're giving it an extended life. You're extending it's continuous. It's evolving. It's not limiting something.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I'm beginning to understand a little better where you're coming from on that. And yeah, just a quick comment on Seth Speaks. I remember back when a friend of mine mentioned the book to me, and I thought to myself, this sounds pretty out there. and so I said, but I'll give it a chance. I'll take a read of it. And so I sat down, and I remember being more impressed by it than I thought I would be. I just thought, wow, how did this woman channel all of this? Or if in fact she did channel it, who the hell was she talking to? This is like kind of in parts very interesting stuff. But I'm having trouble now. I'm going to have to go back and look at it again and see how it registers with me now, because that would be an interesting thing for me to do, I think. But at any rate, yeah, maybe another way of helping me to get a handle on this would be to talk a little bit about how the concept of representation fits in with the notion of limits and relationships that you're talking about. Because I've been so, locked into thinking about language and the use of signs, and the idea that seems to be central to Derrida's approach, that there's a difference between the signifier and the signified, and that difference is crucial. If you break that down in any way, then you destroy the ability of any sign or word to function. There has to be a distinction between the signifier and the signified. And that, for Derrida, at least as well as I can understand it, is crucial. It's irreducible. And he takes that kind of, let's say, duality, and uses it, as near as I can tell, as a kind of a model for understanding every sort of duality. That there is a certain irreducible element to dualities, and if we start collapsing them, then we get into metaphysical terrain that is questionable. And so the idea of representation then is maybe it's been criticized by postmodernists from a certain angle, but when you look at it with respect to the difference between the signifier and the signified, then there is the sense in which the signified represents or stands for the signifier. And so there is a kind of representation going on there. And that then gets into the whole terrain of there being limits, because the way in which we're so dependent on language for our concepts and for our communication and for basically our structuring of the world, then there seem to be limits operating there, as I discuss in my book, about what limits to communication, limits to our ability to use signs and language in ways that permit perfect communication. So there is a gap, let's say, in representation if we're going from the use of a concept like I refer to something as a tree, that may serve some purposes of communication in a general sense, but it's not it's kind of an imprecise tool. So there are certain, that's kind of a sense in which I understand or approach at least one aspect of limits, is that it seems like our concepts, our language, our use of signs or images or anything that's working in a representational capacity has these limits with respect to communication from one person to another. So saying all of that, how would you respond from your point of view on this? Is that a kind of use or an understanding of limits that you can be okay with, or is there a way in which you want to get past that sort of limitation on, say, communication as well? Is that making sense to you?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I'm writing a bit about this lately, and I'm trying to kind of give a more, in the essay that I'm writing, give a more post-structural understanding of karma and like reincarnation, and without using those words, but just kind of giving a kind of feeling for the life of things and the way that they return and how they return and why. And that's also something that's really, I think, almost the most essential kind of theme in Seth Speaks, is kind of giving even though there's no philosophy proper in there, and any certainly no familiarity on Jane Roberts' part of like post-structuralism or anything, but there is this sense of reincarnation not being this law or this limit that just forces you to relive thing out of a sense of like some cosmic justice, but that there are inherent in any idea, there are implications, and those implications though are also relative to other ideas and other contexts. So it's not this overarching law that's imposed on you from a vengeful God or fate, but there is nonetheless like a kind of open structure of limitations that come about through the context within an idea, and everything in a sense being ideas. And so Jane Roberts, even in one of her own books, after she did a lot of Seth books, she tried to kind of more formalize. She started like, well, what's the philosophy going on in here? And even though she didn't know a lot about philosophy, she tried to kind of formalize it. She had some rough understanding of Plato, and she was like, well, it's kind of like the model and the copy, rather than the copy just being like lesser than the model, that the copy is actually changing the model. And so there's this reciprocal determination between copy and model. And it's very similar to what Deleuze talks about in his kind of reversal of Platonism as well. But yeah, in terms of reincarnation, or in terms of some kind of limit or law that is imposed on us, we've in a sense imposed it on ourselves, in the sense that we're always going into contexts with other contexts, and those contexts have a mutual limitation going on. And language, I think, bears that out. Language is just another example of showing the kind of dynamics that are going on in the universe, that there is no absolute copies going on, right? Everything is a transformation. And I think, Derrida is right about that. And, but I think he's kind of like really gets really focused on that kind of that limit of the limit, like in a way it's kind of the an irony or paradox within limits or within truth itself, is that the truth in a sense is the limit that other contexts impose on each other, right? But it's not some absolute like ceiling that like prevents you from the limit is always within the imagination, like what every idea has a context within and that it's playing out in, and that has limits, but those limits are not absolute, and they can be transformed based on like by transforming and transmuting context.
Yeah, that's starting to make sense to me. That's interesting. It's a different way of thinking about limits than I have been used to. Let me ask you this. So taking a look at when is it Roberts is her name?
Jane Roberts.
When she's doing channeling, do you think that what she's receiving, she's translating into language, or is she receiving it as language from whoever she's channeling it from? In other words, is she putting it into language, or is she getting it as language? Or can you answer that?
I mean, she answers that a lot. She goes into a lot of detail because she's a really curious person. Unlike most of the channeling stuff where the person just kind of like, takes it for the gospel truth. She was a very skeptical person. She like grew up Catholic, but and had an interest in mysticism from a religious angle when she was young, but she like rebelled against that because she was very kind of independent. And so even throughout her whole life, and Seth was always talking about this, she felt guilty for what she was doing. She felt she was both from the religious angle of feeling like she was doing something evil, even though she had gotten a long since like consciously rejected religion, but also from a kind of a secular angle where she was just like, I don't know about all this. And so she was always questioning it. But it was just such great material. If she was a writer, she's like, this is like better than my writing. And you could, I mean, she's got multiple books written in her own voice. It's a different voice. I mean, she's trying to do philosophy, and it's not at the level that her Seth books are at. And yeah, it's two distinct personalities. Yeah, so they talk about the levels of like translation and transformation that are going on, and yeah, everything's always at some level of transformation. And when she's channeling, Seth kind of comes through, and her voice changes, and she has a feeling of being kind of like in the background and kind of watching, and so she's not really taking part in it much.
So is it kind of like she feels that Seth is putting words into her mouth, kind of like it's just
she doesn't even remember what happens. She has a vague recollection of like the topics because she has a kind of like a dreamlike sense of like the ideas that he's like, she'll come out of it and be like, so what was he talking about? Something about, and she'll have a rough idea of what the topic was, but she's not there. She doesn't remember any of it. And so, yeah, it's all and the reason supposedly, I guess Seth says like his friends on his level are really impressed that he was able to have such a clear connection. And that bears out from the kind of channeling literature out there. Like there's nothing really that parallels it. I mean, there's a few that are pretty good, but nothing really at that level. And Seth says that he's like, this is a really like unique like level of clarity so maybe like
so wait,
not to get into representation, but I mean it's enough of a small amount of a transformation, enough that to him it was considered a very kind of like close like translation of what he was meaning to say. He still had to work with her concepts though, like he can't just start talking and like give like the answers to this high mathematical stuff that she has no idea of. And so every channel has always said that like that it's depending on the concepts and language of the person. But yeah, so it's using a part of her mind. It's not like she's just a passive speakerphone or something.
I see.
He's using her mind and her personality and her knowledge, but he's able to rearrange it and talk at a high level of things she doesn't understand, but he has to use like what
So
she
it's
has.
kind of like he's using her vocabulary in a sense,
Yeah,
to
linguistic and conceptual vocabulary.
Hmm.
But it also because she was a poet and like a novelistic writer, like I think that's another reason why it's so good. I mean, most new age channels are, I mean, really Castaneda and her, I think, are kind of the best of the new age because they're both really good writers. And like so much of what passes as the new age is just like, at least aesthetically is really bad. Like just like, it's just,
Yeah.
but because of that kind of poetic sensibility, I think it really helps because what he's doing in those books is just giving a very kind of uh down to earth metaphorical, like he's just constantly using metaphors from daily life, and he just makes it all sound, even though it's really far out stuff, he makes it sound like common sense that you don't like feel some kind of, you know like you would get from even most philosophy where you're like getting some kind of system, where he's just talking about what seems natural. It's just like, what is death? Where's the line? Like, when is a tree dead? Like, I mean, just he almost makes it seem like our concepts are the kind of artificial system, and he's just talking about, everything's just training everything else and everything, but it maintains itself within everything else. It's like, is the child's alive in the older man's alive in another life. It's like it's all kind of a version of the same thing, and so you get a very kind of fluid, kind of fractal sense that everything's eternal and but always changing into everything else.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna have to keep working with that, but that's um um really, I think there have been occasions when I've kind of approached that perspective, but not nearly as deep into it as you've gotten. And it's interesting. I've got to open up to that a bit more and see if I can get more of a handle on it. But I think, yeah, it has some potential for rearranging some things in the way I've been approaching some philosophical issues. So that's good. Now, but to touch back on the representation thing a little bit, there's a sense then and in which when I'm seeing let's just call it for simplicity, the limits of communication, um, you begin to understand it as limits when you think of communication as something that some discrete message that is passing from one person to another.
Exactly.
Say, so, well, oh, okay, so this person is never going to get the exact discrete message that I have in my head into their head. But when you think of that as maybe a little abstract or too idealistic or too rigid, and you get away from that and start looking at it, well, maybe communication looked at that way is counterproductive. Maybe we need to look at communication as maybe more like what perhaps I see you doing is relations in which we're in a sense kind of stimulating each other with through words and signs to think in certain ways and to grasp things in certain ways, but it's not crucial from a certain perspective that there be this kind of discrete transfer of information from one mind to another. It's okay, and maybe it's even for the better that it be, that we don't think of communication in that way. So does that begin to edge in the direction that you would feel more comfortable with in terms of talking about communication?
Well, I like talking about all of it. So but it's closer to my view, but I definitely have a deep interest in information theory because I think it is fascinating the way that science has progressed, and this concept of entropy, and I don't know how much you know of information theory, but Claude Shannon figured out that he could put it in a really beautifully simple form if you use the formula for information, or the formula for entropy for information. And so they have the same kind of mathematical form. And so this idea of discrete information is tied up with concepts of the subject and his own expectations, and the kind of the limits that entropy is kind of pointing to as a signifier. And so, yeah, I don't think that there's representation in the sense that something represents something else, but what does it represent? And in reality, if everything is relational, it's representing this whole, everything else in the universe, but within, contested contexts that communication is there to kind of tease out and decide, and like decide which contexts get which play. And so, yeah, it's not that there's identity or representation or any discrete phenomenon need to be thrown out. It's just that that they always are this kind of like collapsing of this open system into a specific context. And if we're aware of that, we're doing that, then there's no need to kind of like, artificially change our language and not like use the word is, like I think is the language of being is very powerful. And as long as you understand that it's what it's doing is that it is kind of like, it's forming a relationship, and that relationship has consistency to it. It has stability, even if it's completely from one angle completely in error and diluted. Like it still can be taken up later and redeployed in some context where it might actually have a new life and a lot more power than it does in some diluted context. And we get that throughout the history of knowledge, where we think, oh, this is disproven, it's it wasn't what we thought it was, but then it ends up serving, and it finds a new way into knowledge through another avenue. And so
yeah, that's interesting. I had this professor when I was an undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara who had a facility for doing something like that. Somebody would come in and just be having a chat with him, and I would be in the room too, and this person would say something, and I would think, boy, that's just kind of a dead idea, and I expected this professor to kind of agree with that and point out that, well, here's a better way of looking at this. But instead, he would take what the person was saying and he would say, oh, that's very interesting. When we put it in this context over here, look what that does. And I would go, wow. I was like, right. It has an interesting application if you think about it from a slightly different direction. And so he helped my progress in the direction of being a little more flexible in my thinking. But yeah, I was always just amazed at his ability to do that. And he would never launch into a criticism of what this person was thinking or how he was organizing whatever. It was always just a kind of an acceptance, and then taking it and running with it a little further in a different, maybe a little different direction or application. And so that was teaching me a certain way to do philosophy that was, still something that I struggle with, because I'm very much more old school in that respect. But I think there's a lot to be said for it in terms of I still kind of like some of my old school tendencies, but I like trying to reach across that to another side, another dimension, and play around with it more, because it opens you up. And I think there's merits on both sides of that, seeing limits in the way that I've been more classically trained, or probably I shouldn't say classically, I should say postmodernly trained, versus what could be what you might call post-essentialist or postmodern thinking in a different direction. So yeah, that's something that I need to spend a little more time thinking about.
Well, Seth Speaks is a great place to start, but it's
Yeah.
you might find it a bit pedestrian, but yeah, it's a good read and it's some cool stuff in it.
I should take another look at that. See how it registers with me now. With what I've been through the last few years. Be interesting. I was trying to remember when what year it was I actually read that. Must have been back in the 1990s, I think. So do you remember when it was published? Approximately
71.
somewhere back in the 70s. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she died pretty young in the early mid 80s, and so she had like I think around 12 to 15 years, something like that, of of channeling Seth and having about a dozen Seth books and her own poetry books, several of her books on her own. The one that and the later ones are kind of poorly edited, so that's always something to keep in mind. Her husband was writing everything down in his shorthand as she was talking.
Oh.
And then to make him feel even more included, they let him like write the notes, which are very kind of uh pretty short in Seth Speaks, but as the books go on, they get longer and longer, and then they get. But if you just know to kind of just skip over because they italicize, so you just skip over these long explanations of like trying. I don't know, they're not good. He seems like a nice guy, but yeah, I think it actually took away from the material. And one of the books that I like the most, Unknown Reality, had to get split into 2 volumes because of all that he had all these notes in there.
Mm.
But it's a good one because I think it's kind of the deepest metaphysical one. Like in Seth Speaks, you get this idea of reincarnation, but he also talks about like probability systems. So you're talking about like kind of similar to the popular concept of the multiverse now, which is something I'm kind of cashing in on. I'm going to maybe title my book something like Philosophy in the Multiverse or something, because it is something I'm very fascinated with. But in that book, they're kind of separate systems. You have the reincarnational system. You have somebody's kind of reincarnated in specific worlds, but then you also have alternate versions or probabilities. But in an Unknown Reality, kind of breaks that down, and even more so where there's no distinction. And so you have like, in a way, like in the most general sense, we're all kind of alternate realities of each other. And so there's no like, this is one of the weaknesses of I think a lot of what you see in sci-fi. Some of them do it better than others, but you'll often see kind of like parallel universes. This is kind of comes out of what I think is a misinterpretation of quantum physics, where there's just many separate worlds, where no, they're all interconnected and interwoven. In an Unknown Reality, at the beginning, they're looking at a photo of Jane when she's a kid on a swing set, and he's telling her like the version of you that was in that photo went on to a different reality. Like and so there's this, even though it was the photo from the reality that this version of you, like they're just looking at it, and he's just like analyzing the soul of her at that moment, like that went on. Like, so there's always, there's this constant weaving in and out of different, what he calls probabilities. And yeah, and this was, I think Deleuze kind of makes this concept a little more sophisticated. He's but it's similar. There's, you don't want to just think of it as probable. It's, the virtual is real. Everything is only virtual from a certain point of view. There's no separate virtual realm and the actual realm, or like, everything it's all one reality, but it is multiple. And this is Deleuze's kind of, what it says, like plurality or monism equals pluralism. Like he has this like concept of univocity based on multiplicity. So in order for things to truly be multiple, they have to be relational and therefore continuous and all part of one
Mm.
thing. And so duality, the Eastern philosophers kind of try to deconstruct it, not because it's bad or not real, but because it is kind of like it's part of the mind's abstraction. Like oppositions are kind of dependent on spatialization of thought, right? This is this, and then the other direction is this, or this negates this because they have a space and they can't both be the same. And I think in that Livingston piece, he said, I think he was kind of trying to keep the law of the excluded middle, but he was still kind of embracing contradiction. But I
Mhm.
think Deleuze very much was critical of the law of the excluded middle, because yeah, it's only when you're kind of rooted in one context or one formal system that things have to be like one or the other, right? And then you have opposites because you have something on one side of the boundary and something on the other.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that whole business of contradiction is a tangled issue. Um, but let me ask you this. It's related to what we've been talking about in terms of limits, representation, and signs and communication, and as well as channeling. But I don't know how much you've thought about it. Maybe you've already thought about it a lot. But what is your take on um, the difference between thought and language? Now, someone like Wittgenstein, is made a case, or at least a relatively strong case for the notion that we think in words, and outside of that, there's really no thought. If it's not in, we begin to think when we begin to learn language, and but there's a whole nother school that says, well, thought is thought, and then we take our thoughts and we basically put them into language. Language is a kind of translation of thought, and that which which makes sense to me a bit in the when I think about the animal world, how animals in a forest, they go about their business, but they definitely have categories and they know the difference between food and non-food, between, say, a plant and an animal. They have ways of distinguishing and sorting out their environment, which you could which you could refer to as a method of categorization. They're categorizing their environment, and they're making, in essence, making abstractions. When they see something as food, they're not necessarily seeing it as a particular, they're seeing it as something that qualifies for something that they can use. And so there seems to me, even at the level of animals who do not have language, there is some kind of thing going on that you could call thought, or a thinking organization of their environment. And so it seems to me to make sense to say, well, human beings are similar in that what we do is that we have a sophisticated language that we can associate with our thinking that helps us to basically not only think maybe more clearly, but also to communicate better than animals do, or at least in a more sophisticated way than animals do. So if there is this difference between thought and language, and then you get into the whole notion of telepathy, and communicating directly, the potential, from mind to mind without the use of any language at all. It seems like you have to admit some notion of thinking being separate from language. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you see them as close, or do you see them as separate?
I mean, if you define thoughts in terms of language, then animals don't have thoughts. But if you don't, you don't. I mean, it depends on where you want to draw the line.
Mm.
The esoteric tradition has interesting I think cosmological history of this. Rudolf Steiner in particular was pretty unique even amongst like theosophists who were already pretty into like lots of Baroque ideas and theories, but he was very interested in thought and the evolution of thought and the evolution of the human soul in its thinking capacity as being a kind of recent innovation in the human soul. And so in theosophy, we had a previous era of humanity, like a different species of us that was, they call it Atlantis, which for them was not some specific place, but a whole like huge eon of time of humanity. And at that point, we were much more telepathic, supposedly. But in the later stages, there was the beginnings of what would later become rational, individualistic thinking. But those people that first were able to develop it, according to Steiner and other theosophists, were able to kind of manipulate the other people that were much more in that kind of like intuitive, imagistic consciousness. And so I think, yeah, you definitely, when talking about thought, though, it seems pretty silly to not include images too. I don't, a lot of just, you don't have to be a great mystic to think in imagery, like, and to think, to do a lot of what we consider thinking with images. So, but yeah,
for Wittgenstein, images were qualified as signs, and that they were just another mode of communicating via signs, and words are signs as well. It's all lumped into the category of signs, and so yeah, it's.
But that's different. Yeah, I mean, clearly animals have, yeah. I mean, I like semiotic thought and thinking in terms of everything's, relational, and so it has a kind of sign-like function. But that's not the same as in my mind as language. I mean, when we say language, I think we're talking about something else, but a more specific kind of sign. A lot of the people in the Persian tradition are like, well, they even talk about not only animal and plant semiosis, but even semiosis in physical systems. And so definitely different than what we call language. Which I think is in a way unique to humans, but it's a particular kind of abstraction on top of abstraction on top of. Well, if you don't like the word abstraction, I like Deleuze's kind of Neoplatonic way of talking about a kind of contraction. You have a contemplation of like everything in the universe is contemplating everything else, and so it's kind of an abstraction, but it's also an extension. So that's again with the limits being also not just a wardening off, but actually kind of extending into a new field, a contemplation, an extension. So yeah, language is just another kind of more sophisticated version of this same process of expressing the idea that the universe is all contemplation. Everything's contemplating everything.
So, but I'm reminded that you didn't seem to like you had some reservations for the metaphor of fractal, fractals as a way of kind of like getting a handle on that notion of everything just being in an unlimited unfolding context. Is that not, I mean, are you okay with the metaphor of fractal?
Yeah, I think you misunderstood me. I'm very much into like fractal cosmology and stuff. I told you in an email I'm very much influenced by this whole kind of group in Europe. Susie Vrobel's one of them. She wrote a book called Fractal Time, and she's looking at time as a fractal. And there's a bunch of other related people that have kind of extended some of her ideas, or they have one book that they wrote together called Simultaneity, which is a kind of a lot of these books that are published by this company, World Scientific, where it's kind of like a lot of interdisciplinary systems theory, complexity theory, chaos theory, fractals, all that stuff's kind of definitely up my alley.
Okay. Yeah, I probably misunderstood you there. Yeah, I think that when I think about fractals, it kind of helps me get a better notion going of the kind of thing that I seem to see you as talking about and
I
emphasize.
think I think what you may have misunderstood me is because you were talking about fragmentation and you were kind of saying, well, you thought, I was kind of talking disparagingly about fragmentation, and then you were like, well, what about fractals? And I was like, well, fractals are also, especially in the way these these people I mentioned talk about the universe, the continuity is part of that, even though they're non-differentiable. There's this one guy who has a kind of fractal cosmology. He's a physicist, and he calls it like scale relativity. And so right, like everything's continuous, but that doesn't mean it's all one block universe where everything's part of one thing. And so yeah, I think this notion of continuity and discreteness are important to kind of tease out in a more complex way, because I think that's, I talk shit about Bohr and complementarity, but like, yeah, I definitely see how he was right and Einstein was wrong, for the reasons that, yeah, Einstein wanted this kind of deterministic continuity of reductionist physics where everything follows from physical forces, and so there must be some hidden physical variable. But that's different than for me, like there's continuity and yeah, there's hidden variables. And for me, complementarity maybe again catches the problem with closed systems and why you no closed system can get the totality. But no, yeah, there is still there is a whole, but the whole is not a containable system. It's not it's what Deleuze and Bergson call like the great outside. It's an open system, and and it's a whole in the sense of only in a kind of in an abstract sense, that it's not a totality. But it is in a way everything is affecting everything else, and so as soon as you have the discrete, everything else as a totality or as a whole is kind of like the background there. And so it's not just like fragmentation. You have like kind of this vision of the fractal where you have like the whole kind of concentrating into the discrete, right? And rather than having a particular and a general, you have the singular, which is and the singular and the infinite, which is and the infinite was within the singular and developing within it, and within that singular thing is the infinite. So there's no finite realm and then the infinite, because that again, that would be then if the infinite is outside the finite, then it's obviously not infinite. There's a paradox or a contradiction there.
Yeah, that's starting to make good sense to me. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at things. Yeah, because the the notion of the whole is something that neither I think Derrida, Deleuze, or certain other postmoderns would want to dispense with. It's just that the whole functions in a different way in the system, or as a system. It's not a complete whole. It's a system that has no closure, but it's one system, in that everything is, like you're saying, related and connected and in motion. That it also speaks again to that issue of transcendence versus immanence. It's like there is no transcendent outside. There's only the transcendent inside, the opening out of the system in a kind of a way which is infinite, but in a what's called infinite finitude. I think that's the expression I've seen used. Is that meshing with what you're thinking?
Sure, yeah. I think Deleuze puts it differently for certain reasons. Like he talks about the infinite as being the great outside because he's averse to, he's kind of coming out of phenomenologically dominated French academia, and he doesn't like Hegel and this everything being kind of contained within subjectivity. So for him, like yeah, there's again a contraction of the infinite or the great outside into there being a barrier. And so then, yeah, the immanent is the transcendent or the transcendental, at least. But it's only transcendent to it's us that we abstract from it, and so then it's transcendent to us, but it's immanent to itself. And so really, so it's also within as well, but it's like it does have a kind of, we calls it a transcendental field, kind of following Kant, but instead of it being a subjectivity, it is infinite outside of the universe that we've kind of turned into an outside only because we've created an inside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I get a sense of what you're saying, but I imagine that there might be anybody who would listen into this. They would think, what? Gets a little tangled, but I think you're expressing it pretty well, actually.
I had a hell of a time figuring out what the hell they were talking about for a couple several years. I was like, what? I mean, but I think it's on purpose. He's like, I'm a transcendental empiricist, and it's like even that phrase, most even people with some background in philosophy would scratch their head at that, because empiricist you would think is not about anything transcendental. But yeah, I think it's brilliant because it is about, like, I think it kind of captures the kind of esoteric spirit, which is this kind of, it always has had a kind of empirical attitude, but it is about some kind of transcendental field. But then he's all about immanence. Well, immanence, yeah, it's immanent to itself, but he's really just kind of just switching things around, because we're used to thinking that the transcendent is what conditions everything, and rather than like what all processes are in the process of conditioning, of determining. And so it's something that it kind of unites the opposites without doing it in a Hegelian way, by like just kind of showing the way that negation is not not outside reality. Identities aren't outside reality. They're not like partial that need to be negated. Negations don't have to be negated to get to the whole, but they do have to be understood as a kind of as a process of limiting the whole.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it is an interesting difference from classical thinking about those kinds of things. Now, there's this guy Martin Haglund, who I mentioned in my book. Very interesting philosopher, but he in part of his commentary, or perhaps even, although I think this is pretty much consistent with Derrida. I don't think it's too much of an expansion on Derrida, but Hagelin talks about a notion that he calls the ultra-transcendental. And something that qualifies as ultra-transcendental, he sees as outside the Kantian framework of the transcendental, in the sense that, well, for Kant, space and time are modes of the transcendental for subjectivity. I mean, that is the context within which everything is received by subjectivity, is through space and time. And he sees Derrida and himself as taking a step beyond Kant, and with what he calls the ultra-transcendental, in that everything that exists, never mind subjectivity or the way in which subjectivity grasps the cosmos or experiences anything, never mind that, but anything at all that exists can only exist within temporality. If there is no time, there's nothing. And that's a bridge beyond a lot of classical thinking on that topic of temporality. And I wonder what you and perhaps Deleuze would think of that ultra-transcendental notion of looking at time and temporality. is there a sense in which you can conceive of something as existing outside of time?
As I was saying, Deleuze has a concept of the eternal. He says that sense is eternal and it's impassive. So it's, in a lot of ways that would be in distinction to what you're saying, because if it's impassive, it's not being affected. But it's not that it's not involved in time, it's immanent to time. It's always being reinscribed in different contexts, but it doesn't change. And so again, you have this, one of Seth's words is that every soul is inviolate. Like, you still have this sense that everything is eternal, even though it's always, entering into new contexts and changing its meaning. And so that's why Deleuze kind of distinguishes meaning and sense, because meaning is always changing and context dependent, but sense is something eternal, in a sense, transcendent, but it's not. And again, similar to this notion of ultra transcendental, yeah, it's not just subjectivity. This is everything. Like, he's talking about everything, the genesis of everything, not just like perception or conception, but the genesis of everything is everything else. Like, everything is the condition for everything else. So it's not just some category of space and time. Those are, I think it's a huge assumption to say that's, just because we have these. I think Kant was a little more careful and intelligent to say, well, we don't know. Like, this is how we see things. To say that, okay, well, then these are universal for the whole universe. I think it's better to say, okay, there's probably these are probably versions of something that is eternal, right? They're a sign of something that is present in everything, because everything is present in everything, not because space and time are special, but because anything that we see is a sign of everything else. And so in a way, it is you can study the whole universe by studying any one process. But to say that, that the form that we see it in is eternal, and that's kind of my problem with complementarity too, is that there's a bit of a dogmatism there, where it's like it has to be these categories are complementary, or at least this kind of incomplete functions put together. Well, that's true, but you can also put different closed or partial systems together. You can kind of correlate them in a way to create continuity too. I don't, Deleuze's concept that philosophical concepts can do that, but you can also, a lot of what I'm into is alternative science stuff, where people are doing it, they're doing science in that way, where they're kind of like creating coherent systems of thought, not based on like distinct categories, but just kind of, I think this is kind of the empirical tradition, as in any case, is that it is always just. Deleuze liked empiricism because he said they're always just creating concepts. It's an orgy of concept creation. They're just like trying stuff out and like do something, and then they find some relation here, and it's not all being related back to some core metaphors of existence, space and time, or otherwise. So I think that there is a sense that time is part of everything, change is a part of everything. But I think our concept of time is a bit of an abstraction. It's an abstraction of the changing aspects of process, but change itself is tied up with our concepts of non-change. And Seth is a big part of the Seth books, because he says that everything actually, and when you see it more clearly, is simultaneous. And so my concept of eternity tends to be more about simultaneity. And I think it has interesting connections to the problems in relativity, where but in the fractal time scheme, Susie Vrobel talks about, she's kind of coming out of Husserl and Bergson a bit, where everything's nesting within context. And so the more that you can nest and kind of create a coherent simultaneity of context, then the less like time as a linear thing happens. And so she has a distinction between temporal depth and then temporal length, and then there's a density, which is the relation of the two. And so the more you can kind of make things mesh together and see everything in one coherent perspective, then the less things have to kind of create temporal length. Maewon Ho has a similar concept too, that comes out of the idea of quantum coherence, that as you're able to kind of make different reference systems cohere, then things are kind of communicating or interacting in an instantaneous way. And by instantaneous, we don't mean that they're frozen, because that means there's no process, but everything is always happening at once. Seth has this word, the spacious present, so it's not this eternal point of the now. You have this large, infinitely connected process that's always happening, but it's happening. The past and the future, all of it are happening, and the past is changing, the future is changing, the present's changing, everything's changing in this one spacious present.
So there may be some compatibility there between what they're talking about with the notion of the ultra transcendental property of time, in the sense that, if everything is a process and a system in motion, the way in which Hagelin, I think, is using temporality is such that what would be opposed to it or contrary to it, here we go with dualities again, but would be the notion of frozen. A frozen universe is something in which there's no motion, there's nothing happening, there's no events, there's no change, no activity, and in that sense, the frozenness of it is a kind of death. It would be a dead universe, a dead cosmos. So for his way of thinking, any process, any movement, any system in which there is change, especially constant change and constant motion, would be a system within temporality. And if you reject that, and you're talking about any notion of something being eternal, then that would be something that is frozen in time. And so
well, the negation of time is an abstraction, right? But so is eternal as the negation, so yeah, when I say eternal, I don't mean the negation of time. I'm talking about something else. So when you think of things as opposites, then they tend to be mutually exclusive. But anything that you can think of, I think, exists. For me, it's like everything's about the relative. When I talk about the real, I mean, if something's real or true, I'm talking about how well it connects to other things. Things that aren't well connected have a relatively low level of reality, but that's not absolute, because from another perspective, again, it could be much more real. So time, similarly, like eternity, similarly, like it's there is such a thing, I think, as an experience of eternity, and it is, but it is an abstraction. So abstractions aren't unreal, they're just limited. And how do you get to that? By disconnecting. That's what Buddhists do. I mean, they kind of look, everything's connected and dependent on, they call it dependent arising. And so once they see that, you can kind of move into the space of absolute emptiness, because you finally kind of disconnected from everything, but it's the ultimate abstraction. But it is eternal. But what's eternally not changing is nothing. But still, that's a truth, right? Nothing isn't nothing. Nothing is still something. There's no such thing as nothing in itself. Like nothing is a relative position of like no connections to anything, right? But it's a perspective that you can take.
Okay, let me ask you, if I were to continue throwing around this term ultra transcendental to refer to temporality,
It's kind of gay.
What
you want me gay? Ultra trans. I'm just being on PC. It's fine. I'm just trying to be funny. Ultra transcendental.
Yeah.
Not your normal transcendental.
Exactly. This is like another realm. But yeah, if I were to continue throwing that term around, would that make you uncomfortable? I mean, is there a sense in which you can have some compatibility with that way of looking at temporality as being so far, insofar as it connects with motion, change, process, all of those things, which seem to be compatible with what you're talking about. Or would you just not like the use of the term like ultra transcendental?
Like I said, it's fun to make fun of. It's not, but yeah, it's fine. I try to be comfortable with everything. I can't say I am, but I try to make everything compatible with everything else. So, but yeah, I think there's a bit too much emphasis on the ephemeral side of existence with not only Western philosophy but in Eastern philosophy. And so that's one thing I found refreshing about the Seth books is this, the eternal validity of the soul. You immediately think, oh, it's, soul, you think identity, you think like this kind of, pedestrian essentialism. But no, I think there's a really deep way of thinking about the other side of things that, complete ephemerality is also an abstraction, right? So any one-sided perspective for me is incomplete. And so to say that there's no such thing as something outside of time, because there's no such thing as anything completely divorced or outside of anything else. So, but I could say that about anything, even the stupidest idea. I'm not opposed to any. I try not to be opposed or outside anything.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting a feel for how you're thinking about things here.
I don't. Again, he wrote a book called Radical Atheism, and a lot of what he's doing is kind of seemingly opposed to the kinds of things that I'm I'm into. So, but that just means I like that you bring them up, and then it's a good point of dialogue. And so I've got nothing against it, but I'll definitely probably try to, push back or push some, or like transform the concepts a lot if I can.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm still processing Hagelin's approach to things. I think he's interesting, but I'm not yet 100% on the bandwagon there. But so we've covered a lot of let's say metaphysical things right now. Do you want to take a little bit of time and touch on a political topic or two? Would that be or do you want to reserve that for another time because you think we might get into too extensive a discussion there, or what?
I'm done. I got time.
Okay. So what's hot on your mind in the realm of politics right now? What in terms of what's going on? Give me a feel.
One of my even philosophical passions has been medicine. I really am moved by the concept of the immune system and the way that it's been challenged by certain books that have really changed my life, specifically the way that the kind of, and actually the Seth books touched on this too. One of my early exposures to a different take on the AIDS crisis, which I think was just one of the most fascinating chapters in the story of knowledge and the sociology of knowledge in particular. And this was happening in the early 80s during Seth's, during Jane's for later books. And so he talks about it. And the late Peter Wilberg that died last year, we spent a lot of time talking about this stuff because we were both very much moved by the Seth books, and he was into some different philosophical stuff. He's much more of a Heideggerian and phenomenologist. But yeah, we really connected on this, especially because it was during COVID and he was having a hard time because of it, and he was dying at the time. So the last year of his life, we talked a lot about this. He's a big fan of this writer Ivan Illich, who I also like a lot. But COVID's really kind of been fascinating, and for a time I was like, he was in a pretty dark place. He was dying and saw the whole world like and for those of us that had a kind of different take on it, it was a bit ostracizing from. Luckily, I have a lot of friends and family that think like me, but I know for a lot of people it was really hard. They lost a lot of friends and family and stuff, and he especially was like really alone in his final days. And but yeah, just right now I'm feeling more optimistic because one of the people that I think is really intelligent on not just this topic, but on most like relevant political topics, has become a viable candidate for president. And so I'm just blown away that that's happening right now, and it's happening, I think, because of the changes in the media landscape. And it's been fascinating to watch the different sides of this thing and the way that it's been playing out. So yeah, RFK Jr.'s I've been a fan of his for quite a while. I think he's really intelligent, and I even think he kind of represents, in a karmic sense, some kind of iteration of a kind of back and forth between different factions of the elite. And I have a somewhat conspiratorial friend of mine that kind of talks about the Rockefeller faction, and he calls it like the Eisenhower slash like Kennedy faction, or even the Roosevelt faction, or something. This kind of alternative, maybe softer. There's different ways of framing it. I don't really buy his categories, but I do think that JFK was. I think he was kind of shitty in his early days, but then something happened, and he really just like decided, like, maybe it was just ego. Maybe he's like, fuck this, I'm tired of getting pushed around. Like, I'm the president, and there's this like deep state. So he pushed back, and he got killed, and then his brother got killed, and then his, Robert's son, rather than, he has this like voice problem for me, when I hear him talk, it just sounds like sadness. It sounds like he's kind of choking up. And he talks about his father and his uncle getting killed in an unemotional way. But yeah, to me, it just seems like an interesting reiteration that he's now like pushing back against this deep state in a way that I've been really a fan of for a while, but I thought he was considered so fringe, and they're still trying to paint him as being so fringe. But the polls that are coming out show a better favorability than Biden, and he's got 20% of previous Biden voters in recent poll. So he's, because of like things like the Joe Rogan podcast, which I saw you poo-pooed on Twitter recently.
Yeah, I had to make some statement about his macho posturing, but
there's that. But he's also just it's great to see that like he gives a space for anybody to just come and like talk about things for however long it takes to talk about them. And I think that's this big shift in the media environment, is that podcasts have become so big because people can do what we're doing and talk about things in depth. And the legacy media, like, nobody's watching anymore. After Tucker got axed from Fox, like, now their numbers are back down. They're relatively the same as the other networks.
yeah.
And yeah, it's like older people that still watch TV for news, where they just get a kind of like propaganda soundbite, and I do think Tucker was kind of in the middle there, where he was like, had enough power that he was kind of started to do things kind of his own way. And I'm sure there are various reasons he got fired, but I think he had a bit of too much of an ego and misjudged, how, like, they obviously care more about like their own ego and their own power and their connections than they do their profit, because I'm sure they knew that they would lose a lot of viewers when they did that. But it just goes to show, like, now he, like, as soon as he went to the internet, he was getting like 100 million views, and Joe Rogan routinely gets 10 times any TV network. And yeah, there's some masculinist posturing and stuff, but yeah, there's just a lot of like places now, and people are kind of more and more people are consuming their media from people that they trust and can get a more intelligent perspective than what the kind of mainstream media does, which is just give the propaganda 2-minute narrative.
Yeah, I've watched some of the Joe Rogan interviews, and he can do a good job in coming up with questions and interrogating various interviewees, and so he's by no means a stupid guy. He's definitely someone who's got some talent and some ability to, and some of the people that he's been able to bring on his show are impressive. And so, and the audience that he brings. But I just been a little bit irritated by his misogyny and his outspokenness against women and whatnot, or at
What did
least
he say?
I'm trying to remember. There was somebody who quoted him as saying something about women that was just really outrageous, about how they just need to shut up.
What?
Yeah, I'll see if I can find it, but I can't remember it exactly right now.
I have a friend of mine that won't ever listen to anything that I say Nietzsche says because he'll just be like, oh, misogynist comments. I'm like, ah,
yeah.
it's a joke.
Well, I won't stop listening to Rogan for that reason. I think that people have lots of different aspects to them that can be interesting, and
And
so,
I don't tend to watch him, but I watched him. I watched the 3 hour interview he did with RFK because I care a lot about RFK, and he's been doing the rounds on a lot of the podcasts that I think are doing an all a kind of more open, non-propagandized, independent thing. And so yeah, I think that the fact that his popularity keeps increasing shows how the narrative isn't working anymore. And then there's various reasons for that too. I think, yeah, in the last few days has been very interesting. Like one of the guys that Rogan had on, a vaccine scientist, he's like offered one of the things that him and RFK said. It was like, RFK's like, no one ever debates me. Like he'll debate anybody. He says that he wants they said, well, you'll interview this person and you get half the time. He's like, fine. He's like, well, you're gonna get even less the time. We're gonna have 2 people. Oh, there's gonna be 3. It's gonna be 4, and you're gonna get 15 minutes. He's like, fine, whatever, I'll do it. And he flies a red eye there, and he gets there, and there's 4 empty chairs. It's like no one debates him. And so Joe Rogan's like, this is ridiculous. He had a vaccine scientist on previously, and he's like, will you please come back? He's like, I'll come back anytime, but I'm not gonna debate RFK. And he's like, I'll give you $100,000 to your favorite charity. And then everyone started piling on, and all like half of Twitter just like all these people started donating money. It got up into the millions. And the guy's like, won't do it. And then he won't even no one will answer any of the or debate, or even in just on social media, like say this is where RFK is wrong. Everyone just says, they just throw out like insults. And yeah, so and this just happening at the same time that like lab leak stuff's coming out more, and it's just like all this stuff that got repressed and got turned everybody that was saying these kinds of things into conspiracy theories. Oh, look, it's not a conspiracy, it's true. I think more and more people are like, okay, like starting to see through the bullshit. So some people, I mean, probably not enough to get them elected because there's so much going against them. But I'm just happy that as I was saying, this topic that's been really close to my heart and is I think really affected me negatively, just I don't know, AIDS especially. Like I grew up in the 80s, and they were like, if you have sex with the wrong person, you're gonna die. And I already grew up Catholic, so it was like double whammy of like I was just starting to be like waking up out of religion and be like, no, that's bullshit. And they're like, but here's science, like have sex with someone, you'll die. And it's like, and so it kind of added to that whole thing with me. And then just reading the way that legitimate, like the way scientists were smeared, and the way that the propaganda machine worked around AIDS. I read so many books on it because it's just so fascinating from a sociological perspective, like the way that and so it's kind of been a big motivation for a lot of the philosophy I do, because I want to kind of give people an understanding that at a various levels that something being a fact or true is really not that important. Like things can be true, but they can be very distorted. So I don't want to be like, oh, there's so much in the media of just like back and forth, like, you know, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're disinformation, you're a conspiracy theorist, or you're just, you know, or you're just like bought out by this industry, you know, like, okay, but to what extent are they true, and what are the contexts? And I think people have a really bad sense of being able to do that anymore, where everything has to be either true or false. And what I want to like give people understanding of better is like, hey, there can be different ways of looking at things, and that can actually change the type of facts that are relevant. And with like disease and biology, like the way that kind of the progress of knowledge has been kind of shifted in this direction. I was just in a really deep level for years, had a feeling that this was going to be a big deal before COVID hit. I mean, AIDS was, I think it definitely affected a lot of people, and I was annoyed that way it affected my psychology, but you know, it was kind of minor compared to what was happening with COVID. And so when COVID hit, I was like, I knew it. I knew this was going to be like I could just see that it was just such an important thing that hardly anybody was aware of, and it was so fringe. And now with COVID being like, oh my God, this is like, and now I'm even more, now I'm like, this singular perspective is making me like, and my friends like pariah, like you, like people are losing their jobs, like in an era where everyone was so sensitive about like the history of discrimination, and everything's about, you know, race and gender and discrimination. And yet people with this one point of view aren't allowed to like leave their house. You know, you can't come back to society. You can't have a job. You can't go on an airplane. And no one, like, I was just blown away and was a bit like worried. But yeah, but now like things have been changing, and the things that I was scared about are still rolling full steam ahead. But there's a sizable number of people that are kind of not buying it. So that's making me happy.
Yeah, it's really a difficult thing because from the point of view of the pro-vaxxers, the effectiveness of a vaccine depends upon the breadth with which you can vaccinate people. The whole idea of a vaccination begins to collapse if, say, you're only getting 50% or 30% of people involved in it. Scientifically, it depends on, okay, as many people as we can get vaccine, then the better it's going to work. And that presents a kind of sociological problem when you have people who are philosophically opposed to it and find that it's unpersuasive in with respect to what they think of as the science on it. So yeah, and then you have to make a decision. Well, do we respect these people's decisions? If we do, then the effectiveness of our vaccination program begins to drop. And once we begin, accepting this counter argument, then it might escalate, and pretty soon the whole point of the vaccination might become moot. So you've got,
It's that narrative that was really motivating them to call the mRNA shots vaccines, when they, there was, especially in that respect, there was no similarity. Like, it's basically a gene therapy. And I mean, at some point they were kind of trying to make the argument that there was some kind of herd immunity thing, but that quickly went out the door when it was obviously not the case, that people that were getting the shots were, quote unquote, spreading it equally. So
yeah, it's been a complicated and divisive issue. But so you like the way in which RFK Jr. has been exposing the likelihood that this originated in the Wuhan lab. And
I mean, I don't really care about that. I mean, honestly, I don't. What I find more interesting is the concept of these things. So like the concept of a virus, the concept of a vaccine. We'll say the concept of the vaccine, well, because it has all these, all these implications that there might be a potential reason to, force people, because everyone depends on, so that word vaccine has a lot of power, and also the word anti-vax has a lot of power, and so you can there's a long history of vaccine skepticism. Gandhi was very, very vocal about it. Like in various countries, there's a huge history to it, but it's gotten a lot of stigma. So that has a lot of power each way. And then the word virus, that has a lot of power too, and the way that concept has been constructed in order to explain disease. It's just a great, for me, it's just such a great practical focal point for so much of what I'm interested in philosophy. And not only Derrida's kind of concept of purity and which I think kind of maps onto this really well, but Deleuze's concept of the way that kind of identification covers over the kind of open system of conditions that are underlying things. And so especially with viruses have become the preferred concept for disease, because you can kind of paint any kind of environmental condition as an infectious disease, which then translates super well into industrial medicine, and it covers over any kind of liability that the larger industrial sector has for causing diseases from environmental pollution. So there's we could go into that if you want at some point, but I could, the whole ad bleak thing's kind of complicated, but I actually question the concept of a virus in the first place. But RFK doesn't go that far, but he's a very open-minded person, and he's just trying to show the facts and all the studies that get kind of completely ignored and repressed, and the propaganda narratives that most people are exposed to.
So with respect to vaccines, in regard to viruses, what would you like to see in the future going forward? Do you want to see like vaccines do you want to see that kind of dropped as a medical treatment, or as a way of understanding viruses and dealing with viruses? Or how far does it go for you? What would you like to see politically happening on that?
I mean, for me, I have a rather extreme view, so I don't expect things to like shift to my point of view, or would, in certain company even press my point of view, because I think it requires an entire like shift in a lot of basic categories that people have. Politically, I would just like to see what RFK is doing, which is, just getting more actual studies and research so that people could see like the lack of effectiveness and the dangers as well. That's what he's doing, and he's not even running on that. Like, he's just, that's just something he talks about in the Joe Rogan interview. I highly recommend it. I think it's a good in-depth thing, and they focus more on vaccines than he usually does in interviews, because Joe Rogan is on Spotify and he can do whatever the hell he wants. If he barely touched on vaccines with Jordan Peterson the other day, and YouTube took it off. Another guy I like a lot, Dark Journalist, interviewed RFK like 2 years ago, and it's been up on YouTube this whole time. And then as soon as RFK started getting attention a couple of weeks ago, boom, that came off of YouTube. So it's like he's getting pulled left and right off of YouTube, and so it's obviously not his major issue. Like, I think he's got the right take on the war, on various things, and so he's not like trying to like lead with that. But Joe Rogan asked him a lot of questions about it, and he does a good job just talking about how, hey, I had no interest in this, and he has. I mean, it's been one of the worst things he could do for his career, obviously. But he did it because some mothers just kept harassing him and being like, you're fighting all these lawsuits. Yeah. So
that's what I heard. Yeah, he was getting a lot of constituents asking him and pressuring him to do something about it, and he researched it and discovered there was something to it from his point of view, and so he wanted to act on it. Yeah. Well, it's a difficult issue. But is that one of the since it's not, you're saying it's not a central issue in his campaign, what other items or topics attract you to him? you say issue on the war, or his position on the war.
I think maybe one of the, I think actually, as much as I dislike Jordan Peterson, I watched his whole interview with him, which you can't watch on YouTube anymore. But you can probably find it somewhere else. But he does ask one good question, and it's just like, what, even if you got into office, like, how would you do any better than Trump at changing out this huge momentum of the previous, the larger infrastructure of civil service, just all the people that you need to run an executive branch. And I think that was one of Trump's big problems, is that he has had this very negative take on, like, I'm going to drain the swamp, but like his connections are all like business elites and mafia guys. Like he needed people within Washington to run things. And so as much as he wanted to drain the swamp, like, he didn't have the experience or the connections, right? And so he ended up, and even if the people that he did bring in were like Steve Bannon, were like, not a big team player and were too idealistic, and got pushed out immediately. And then the whole Russiagate thing, they pushed out Flynn. So he got outmaneuvered pretty quick. So whatever he was trying to do, like, he wasn't able to do it. And so, Peterson's like, well, what difference? He's like, well, what are you gonna? RFK was just pretty adamant, being like I have people in mind. I know exactly who to fire, and I know exactly who to hire, and I have plenty. I think has enough connections to know, like, what the problem is. And the main problem for him is regulatory capture. And there's so many related problems, but like getting money out of politics, sure, but that's kind of a broad general thing. But I definitely think with the regulatory agencies, it's super important. And I could see that now. I mean, the corporations have bought government in so many ways, but like, those, especially with when it comes to medicine and just being able to live and breathe without getting poisoned or forced into taking a poison, like, for me, is like, I'm relatively comfortable at ignoring politics a lot of times, but it's suddenly when things happen, and then I'm like, not because I don't care, but because I don't really like. There's only so much change that can happen, and I usually kind of look at things on a more abstract level. I don't really pay attention to the daily news cycle usually, but like when it was really affecting me, and I think was taking us down a dark road. I get really concerned. I got really concerned with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and one of the reasons I was happy that Trump first got elected, because I was really worried what they were going to do with that. They were going to kind of have a kind of corporate international system and courts that could just say, hey, if Eugene, where I live, we were like, oh, we don't want genetically modified foods, then we could be tried in an international court, and that was the precedent that was getting set. Trump nixed that, which was one good thing that he did. But now we have it's happening through alternative route here, and then the World Economic Forum and various agencies are still trying to set up this kind of global technocratic system, and right now they're in the process of giving the World Health Organization tons of powers that it shouldn't have. And I think so. I think this, even though he's not leading with the vaccine issue, because it is just a subsidiary of this larger issue of agency capture, I think it's an important kind of battleground of, like, maybe not the way to handle it, maybe not focus on that, but like, it is part of this larger issue of, like, science being completely co-opted by state interest, and state interest being co-opted by corporate interest. And it is a kind of a fascism that is, I think, much more insidious than what the Nazis were doing. I think the smart Nazis knew that they were going to lose the cultural battle, and they got incorporated into the U.S. deep state. And I don't think that they lost the war. I think in a lot of ways the Nazis and the Americans kind of like joined forces, and the people that were the more crazy, adamant on the cultural side of things lost, but the technocrats and the Nazi apparatus just went right into the burgeoning deep state in the U.S. And they've continued to do what the Nazis want to do, which is to have a kind of technocratic control over everything. And so part of what I think philosophically is wrong is that a lot of Nazis get blamed, or Nazism is an excuse to blame and like repress kind of romanticism and metaphysics, when really it was the technocratic component that I think was the most dangerous about the Nazis, and that's been only escalated by the U.S. deep state.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the philosopher Heidegger gets such criticism, and probably to a certain extent rightly so, for his affiliation with the National Socialist Party. Through he was actually a member of the Nazi Party throughout the war, and but the stance that he took on technology, when you think about that in relation to Nazism and what was going on in the technocratic state, and their obsession with technology, and especially weaponization of technology, is really interesting, in that you could take Heidegger and generate a very significant critique of that whole approach, and yet there's a sense in which Heidegger thought of the National Socialist Party as being a viable alternative to American democracy and Soviet communism or Bolshevism. But yeah, you're right. And at the end of the war, there was this co-optation by the American military, especially getting their hands on these Nazi scientists and rocket engineers, bringing them over here, and just extending that program, because the new devil in the whole system was now the communist devil, and that had to be handled. And the former
Well, that's the excuse, but yeah.
yeah, I mean, it was a convenient excuse for the militaristic agenda. But yeah, it launched well, and we're still in the throes of that, what you call the deep state, that extended through the Truman administration, Eisenhower, Kennedy. Everyone was gobbled up. Every president has been gobbled up by that militaristic, and the intelligence agencies are part of it too, in this deep state operation that is beyond electoral politics. These people are untouchable.
Yeah, there's a good book written about it called Double. I think it's part of the title is The Double Government, and they talk about they call it deep state, which is kind of a loaded term now, but they call it like the Trumanite, and then you got the Madisonian. So you got these two levels of government, and yeah, the deeper layers, and I don't think RFK could, root that out either. And he would have to, it would be interesting to see him in what ways he would recapitulate his uncle's struggles with being constantly in tension with him. I mean, Trump to some extent was fascinating for that reason too, because he obviously had a tension, but he had to work with them. But the little that he was able to kind of change about foreign policy, I was happy with, and that's kind of one of the things that I usually care about the most with the president, is just I feel a little bit of responsibility being an American, that the presidential election can have a huge effect on the foreign policy, which affects, I think, a lot of people all over the world. And so, Trump was a little bit less war. So it was I feel like maybe it was, he was better for that reason, because Hillary was super intent on confronting Russia and China. And now we are with Biden doing that. And I think we need at least a president that's at odds with them can slow things down a bit. And that was my only thing with Trump, is I felt like he was his antagonisms were slowing the machine down a bit and what they were trying to do. But I think RFK, if it was possible that he got elected, he could actually make some positive changes and make people a little bit more aware of things. I think he's already doing that, whether he wins or not. Like just the platform that he's gotten, like people are listening to the kinds of ideas that I've been into for years with more of an open mind, and so I'm already like pleased.
Yeah, I can go along with some of that. I think my major problem with Trump is that he just struck me as pathological on so many levels in his personality, and so incompetent with respect to how to function in Washington and in government. I mean, like he barely understood how a law gets made into a law, or how a bill gets made into a law. It's those sorts of things that are troublesome. But the other thing is that I don't think the United States has to do a heck of a lot with respect to foreign policy regarding Russia and China, because those two countries are on a very massive self-destructive track right now. And if we just leave them alone, they're going to disappear. I think the totalitarian aspects of those two states are such that they need to disappear. They're not doing anybody in the world any good, especially their own citizens, in my opinion. So,
I would disagree with that, but we don't have to talk about it. It's kind of not that interesting. But
well, I just think, for all of its flaws, democracy is the wave of the future. I mean, granted, it's got a lot of ways in which you can criticize it, but if you don't give people the vote, if you don't give them some freedom, especially in the information age, you are on a trajectory of doom as far as your state goes. And that's going to play out, I swear to God, in the next 20 years. You're going to see a massive shift politically throughout the world, even though everyone now is crying out saying, fascism is gaining steam. I don't think so. There's a huge backlash going on with respect to that far right wing of politics in the world, and it's going to play out very differently than what I think some pundits are saying in that respect. So
I'll agree with that. I don't think the far right has a future, but
yeah,
I fascism is a loaded term, and both sides use it in different ways. So.
yeah, it is a loaded term, especially when we start talking about the fascism that exhibited in the United States, and in its military and its aspects of its government. But yeah, it's we call ourselves a democracy, but we're a very imperfect democracy. And if we don't watch out, we're going to screw up the democracy altogether. But it's, I think, a healthier form of government, and it encourages citizens to get more involved in government, which I think is really needed. And but getting back to RFK Jr. a bit, so how do you and I probably have to wrap this up pretty soon, but how do you see that playing out politically? Is he now he's not, is he running within the Democratic Party? So
Yeah.
he's going to be in the primaries with Biden and perhaps others, and it will depend on how he can do in the primaries, whether or not he can emerge as the nominee. So, well, that could be interesting, to see how how strong Biden is as a candidate. He gets challenged by a Kennedy.
Yeah, I don't know if it has anything to do with the strength of Biden. It's the strength of an entire system that's propping him up, and I feel sorry for him. I think I think it's kind of elder abuse at this point. They're just like pushing him through the motions, and but yeah,
Well,
we'll see.
I think he's on board with it. Maybe at his age he shouldn't be, but he seems to see himself on a mission. And as long as he's thinking that way, I think he will take the encouragement from the party. But
Yeah, I try not to be too tied up with winning or losing any kind of fight or argument or debate or political contests, because for me, like the long-term game is what's important, and so I think that's
Yeah, I think
something that
the short term looks kind of ugly on all sides, you know. We've got to get through the next 10 years somehow and get some fresh candidates in there and hope that things can take a more positive direction. But right now, our government and our Congress and everything is limping along. And it's yeah, it's kind of sad.
one of the reasons that essay that you read of mine had the phrase psychic politics in the title. That's actually the title of one of Jane Roberts' books that she wrote on her own. And yeah, that's, to me, that's what's really important, is that it's there is a kind of occult contest going on underneath the surface of everything, and then what we see and actually happening is just very much downstream from that. And so that was kind of a big theme of that essay, was just that, you know, there's this realm of intensive relations there, that everything kind of gets decided on that level of intensity. The things that have the most intensity can maybe reach the level of manifestation in our, physical reality. And so, yeah, the political battle on that level is not only like just short term. It often is, at the mercy of forces that are not really apparent. And so a lot of people, I think, mistakenly fight for one idea or side or another, but because of the kind of underlying like occult energetics of it, they end up actually, undermining what they're fighting for, because of the way that they're fighting, and they don't know that the kind of spiritual forces at work, quote unquote, are maybe perhaps different than the labels and identities that they use to kind of frame things.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of expressing it. Yeah. Well, it's sort of a situation with respect to politics where I feel I'm gonna get back to my Catholic roots and think about praying again. It's just, God help us. Hopefully something good will happen. So yeah, we probably share that perspective. It's like a trying time for Americans. Well, to wrap things up, maybe I think I feel good about my progress in understanding more where you're coming from philosophically. I think it's making more sense to me, and I think that yeah, there's some good things in there, and that I want to explore further. And so, on that part of our discussion, I'm thankful for what you have contributed, and the political thing, I think, yeah, is complex, and it's I don't think we've drawn any conclusions there, except that RFK might be an interesting candidate to see how things play out there. So, any comments for you in wrapping up here?
I appreciate you as always. You've been a constant source of intelligent conversation and mutual reflection and dialogue, and even in respect and even in disagreement. And that's always been a source of inspiration and new ideas for me too. So it's always, I find myself always wondering what you would think of things, and so I appreciate your even and especially your critical comments. And so thank you as always. And yeah, I look forward to talking with you more. I like your ideas, and I hope you could get another book or so in you. So hope you keep writing.
Yeah, I'll probably getting back to it. I feel some things percolating. So yeah. Well, good. Yeah, I really enjoy our talks. So we'll have to do it again, and there'll be some Yeah, I need to sit on what we talked about today a little bit more, but maybe in another week or two or so down the road, we can talk again and may have some more questions for you. And I think I will take another look at this Seth Speaks. I've got to remind myself and check in with that again, because there were some things in there that I thought were interesting, worth looking at.
I would love to get your feedback on that. That would be very interesting to me. So let me know.
Okay, great. Well, have a good rest of the evening.